right, it's 9:50, so let's get started. Welcome to today's session on innovating together on new partnership models for co-creation of digital tools and initiatives. My name's Talia Dweck. I work for DAI Center for Digital Acceleration. In this session, as the description said, we're going to focus on new partnership models that have proven key to driving social impact at a scale. And we have three great speakers today. First, Leila Toplic, who is the lead for emerging technologies at NetHope, Lucie Schnitzer, head of community at Omdena, and finally, Paul Moseley, the CEO of BonRezo. So given that we have three speakers, and this is a topic that so many people have so much to say about, we really want to make this more of a discussion. So we really welcome your input. If you can type your input into the chat, and then I'll invite you to come off mute and join the discussion. We would love that. To start, I'm going to give each of the speakers 5 minutes to present on introduce themselves and present on their partnership models. As I mentioned, if questions come up during that time, please put them in the chat. We welcome that. And then I'll have some questions for the speakers. And then we'll also have some designated time at the end where you all will be able to engage more in the conversation as well. Great, so let's get started. I am going to give the mic over to Leila from NetHope.
Thank you, Talia. Good afternoon, everyone. Sonia, if you don't mind just pulling up my slides, that would be great. So in the meantime, just a brief introduction to NetHope for those of you who are not familiar with NetHope. It's a nonprofit technology consortium of nearly 60 global NGOs, organizations like CRS, Plan International, Save the Children, NRC, and many others. And what brings these organizations together is really the belief that through partnerships and meaning collective impact and with the support of technology, we can tackle some of the global challenges that we're talking about at this conference. And also in my work as the lead for the Emerging Technologies initiative at NetHope, I focus on helping NGOs specifically learn about technologies like AI and also get started with using AI in a meaningful, in a responsible and sustainable way. And we'll talk a bit about that in this session today. So before I share one of the examples that I picked for you today, I want to just briefly give context for those of you who are not yet getting started with AI and working with AI, why NGOs are evaluating the suitability of AI for our work. First, we see the potential in AI to support every aspect of our work, and I'll talk about one of the aspects through the example a bit later. So some of the potential in extending the reach of humanitarian services and support like education, health, and other services, improving effectiveness of the humanitarian interventions, and then also helping us make decisions and act faster in emergencies through real-time awareness of the situation. I'll later on share a blog post that summarizes some of the key benefits, but also some of the challenges. And that's kind of takes me to the next point, which is that there are also a number of challenges to humanitarian and international development sector adopting and applying AI and doing that again in an ethical and meaningful and sustainable way. And addressing these challenges requires partnerships, both within the sector and then also across the sector. So I'll give you an example of a partnership model, one of the many models we have specific to AI that is focused on addressing some of the actually challenges that nonprofits faced as we all quickly shifted to remote work and social distancing due to the pandemic. And these are, again, not new challenges, but they were amplified by the pandemic. So if we go to the next slide. So briefly, just to frame, what is the problem? What are the problems that our NGO members in Africa specifically were looking to address? First, really the need to reach more people with services and information they need, and specific services around tech support, and then in terms of information, IT knowledge that their staff needed to have. And then also at the same time to free up the limited human resources in order to focus on higher priority work. So the target audience specifically that was experiencing these pain points were nonprofit staff, so both IT and ICT for D, but also programs and more broadly. And then the solutions that I'll talk about a bit in this context were actually chatbots. The kind of the focus of this discussion is partnership models. So before explaining the partnership model, it's important to really start with understanding what are some of the challenges that nonprofits were facing with regards to addressing the specific problems that are stated here. So one is awareness of the type of capabilities, as well as tools that are available. Second is expertise to get started and to build some of these solutions. And third is resources, and that could be really funding in order to free up some of the staff time in order to develop these solutions and integrate them into the organization and programming. So the partnership model that we specifically structure around addressing these challenges and developing the solution that I mentioned earlier, one was set up to provide support in the form of seed funding, expertise, and then also facilitation because there are multiple organizations involved, keeping everyone on track and accountable. Second, providing initial awareness through training, which we did in July with the whole Africa chapter, but then followed by project-based capacity building in terms of building capacity in specific technology tools. And in this case, we're using a no-code tool from Microsoft called Power Virtual Agents. And also in terms of the process, how do you develop and design a really meaningful, relevant solution? One of the important points, which is really bolded and highlighted here, is to establish the local ownership from the initial project concept. So really defining what's the problem, who's the target audience, what's the user journey, all the way through development. So specifically, the NGOs really owning developing these chatbots, deployment, and maintenance. What I've included down below in these kind of chevron blue and orange boxes is really just some of the key steps in this process. And that takes me to the next point, which is that we're in the process today, we're implementing agile and iterative approach. What that means is that we got to an MVP quickly in order to really iterate with the end user feedback. So really making sure that our hypothesis around what the solution might be, what are some of the user journeys as part of that solution is really validated through the feedback of the end users, and that feedback is incorporated in the future MVPs. Along the way, we're paying close attention to some of the ethical considerations, from the data to team to sustainability of the solution. And then also part of the partnership model is to ensure broader impact through collective impact approach. In this specific example, what that means is one of the chatbots is a collaboration between the multiple NGOs, in addition to obviously NetHope and Microsoft supporting. And we're planning to templatize both chatbots for broader usage, both by NetHope members and more broadly, again, in order to enable others to benefit from the same solution. And if we go to the next slide, I want to make sure that you all have access to some of the resources that were developed by NetHope's AI working group that have been key in really helping us evaluate suitability of this technology for this specific problem, but also guide to optimize the specific solution to be ethical and responsible in the context of the specific target audiences and the context in which those target audiences work and live. So there are two toolkits that are available to you. One is it was a release last month. It's AI Ethics for Nonprofits Toolkit. And the second one is AI Suitability for Nonprofits. Both of them include a set of questions that you can use, again, to guide the development of your AI project. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Talia. I'm sure there are going to be a number of other questions and examples, and we'll follow up on that in the Q&A section. Talia, over to you.
Great, thank you, Leila. That was great. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you have questions or comments, please use the chat and I'll invite you to come off mute. Now over to Lucie from Omdena. Lucie, it looks like you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm just sharing my screen. Can you all see it?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. So, oops. Okay. So if everyone can see it, thanks for the giving us an overview, Talia. I'm excited to get into the discussion later with Leila and Paul. Just to give you an overview, I'm going to keep it short. So I'm the head of community, part of the founding team at Omdena, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about our business model and how we use bottom-up global collaboration as an AI development platform to build ethical and efficient solutions for organizations of all sizes. And before going into that and how our partnership model looks and our business model looks in collaboration with our partner organizations, I think it's important to just give you a little bit of the history and motivation behind founding Omdena. So we were founded 1.5 years ago, 18 months ago, by Rudra Debmitra. He's been in the AI industry for over 10 years. And the main motivation of founding the company was really threefold. One was to tap into the global talent pool, so the wisdom of the crowd that now through the democratization of education and all of the readily accessible access to education and knowledge is not really reserved for that top 1% anymore, right? So there's a global talent pool that can be leveraged to solve some of the most pressing problems, and it's really needed to solve some of the problems that we're facing today, which leads to the second motivation of, there are problems that are faced by humanity, by all of us, and there's plenty of them to be solved. And most of the top tech giants are focused on building autonomous vehicles and traveling to space and all of that, which is futuristic and it's going to be relevant. But there's a huge pool of problems that are focused at the people at the bottom of the pyramid and need this global talent and global collaboration to solve. And that leads me to the third motivation, which was really why not solve those problems using global talent through collaboration, bottom-up collaboration rather than competition. Because in the world nowadays, there's so much competition. There's companies, ideas, solutions competing against each other, but why not collaborate on them? Because what we're facing nowadays is really you need all sorts of expertise and backgrounds. So what that looks like now. So now as a platform, what we do is we partner with organizations, large, small, public, private, who are solving meaningful problems, and we connect them to global people. So our collaborators from all over the world who are connected to the problem or really want to solve those problems. And in combination with our processes, our tools, our knowledge base, we cultivate an environment and we facilitate that bottom-up collaboration. So it's really the people that we get together. So now, where does efficiency and ethical come in? So how does that turn into ethical and efficient solution building? So the efficiency comes in where we get, the problems that we're solving with our organizations, we solve them in 2-month timeframes. So we have highly motivated individuals from all over the world that want to solve these problems and do so in a limited time frame. So that leads to rapid iteration, and that also leads to quick idea generation. So that's where the efficiency comes in. And now when we're talking about ethical solutions, and that's something that Leila was also talking about, is in order for a solution to be ethical, you need to have diversity of thought and you need to have different background, because otherwise it's not scalable. So we, on our platform, every project that we do, a project is sized 40 to 60 people 20 to 25 countries. And as a platform, we have 35 to 40% lead engineers are women. We have representation across different countries and continents, age groups ranging from 17 to 65, and then years of experience, of course, ranging from anywhere from 1 to 7+ years. And that really leads to ethical solutions, because unethical solutions or solutions that contain bias, these big topics nowadays, isn't because the solution is unethical, it's because the people who build those solutions are. And that's kind of how what we've seen over the past 1.5 years, partnering with or executing 43 projects across 88 countries, is that the diversity is what makes these solutions scalable and applicable to the real world. And now I'm just gonna close this off, because I want to get into how we use that model to partner with organizations, as I said, startups, NGOs, across public and private sector. And the 3 use cases that I'm going to go into in our discussions later are really about the different ways that we partner with them. So we use the same model, but for example, World Resources Institute is an NGO, global NGO, and what we've done with them, we're on our 5th project with them. What we do is we prototype for them. So they use, within 2 months you can't build a full product, but we create prototypes that they can go back and get funding for to scale out, and we've helped them scale that out as well. And then also International Social Services, we build a roadmap for NGOs, for example, who have never heard of AI or data science before. And then we also work with startups where we actually iterate on top of their solution that's already existing. So I'm excited to get into all of that, but for now, to keep it brief, I'll hand back over to Talia.
Great, thank you so much, Lucie. I just want to remind people to use the chat. We'd love to hear your questions and comments throughout the presentation. I now am going to hand the mic over to Paul to talk about his partnership model.
Thanks, Talia. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, just talk
Hello.
A little louder into the mic.
Okay, I'm going to hold it up like this. And
yeah, that might
I have
be better.
a slide. Great. If you could throw the slide up. Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Moseley. I'm the CEO of BonRezo. We are a management consultancy. We do ICT and management consultancy in East and West Africa. And we really focus on ecosystem integration. So it's a great time for us. The Gates Foundation, DFID, USAID, Rockefeller Foundation, all of those organizations in their digital strategy are focusing on ecosystems, which is really pulling things together at scale. So I have an intentionally generic slide here, but just talking about one of the projects we're working on that we can address how we're supporting and developing partnership models to drive truly sustainable commercial scale. So in this project, for instance,
Paul, I can't hear you well.
hello?
Yeah, I think maybe you turn the volume down on your mic, or.
Let me change.
I don't know if others can hear him.
No,
No, it's Rizzo.
Okay. No.
Hello?
That's great. We can hear you now.
Cool. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is a project from a consortium of universities who came up with a model where they take freely available satellite images, nothing special about them, and they apply an algorithm to them. And so this is in the agriculture and finance space where we spend a lot of time. And so, for instance, if you take a plot anywhere on the earth, and then they take an available image, think of a Google Maps image, and then they put in a lot of inputs, like what kind of seeds and fertilizer might that farmer use, and then all the historical climate data. Then they bounce that against a supercomputer, and they come back with, well, what is the expected yield of that crop on that piece of land? How is the crop progressing? And most importantly, what would be the risk score of lending to that farmer? So now at this point, there's a lot of use cases for this, right? There's lending, insurance, food balance sheets for governments. But what they decided to do is take the insurance route. So let's go to this next slide. Thank you. And so with this model, with all the capacity and capability of that AI model that they developed, they created commercial crop insurance models. And the cool thing is this one product can reduce a bank's lending risk by 70%. Farmers can get insurance, so on and on, great global good, right? But it's not something that happens by itself. So the partnership model in this project is really to go to large communities of farmers, 50 to 100,000 farmers. Engage a lender, engage an insurer, a reinsurer, off-takers, farmer groups, and tech partners. And so it takes really a village of pulling everybody together in each of these communities to create an insurance product for that community based on this one central AI capability. So the key considerations that we found in partnering model, because this is really co-creating a market from a piece of AI, whatever it is. And the first thing is to create, we work on creating a bridge between the academic institution or the research institution and the commercial market. And in this case, the academic institution teamed up with a reinsurer who committed to back an insurance product, right? So that they had that hook. The second thing that we do, and when these are NGO nonprofit funded projects, often the conversation really centers on the goals and milestones for the nonprofit, but it's really important to go through each of the commercial partners' strategic objectives and making sure that everybody is clear on what they get out of it and what they're going to put into it. So we try to create a market model that everybody's going to be able to live with and moving them into a market they wouldn't traditionally go into. And then the third piece is that bringing in government, even in co-creation models, is really important. It adds sustainability and long-term backing around this. And then for a model like AI, the data that comes off of this, the exhaust, is great for governments. And then finally is to engage the full ecosystem. So on a lot of when I was at the Gates Foundation, a lot of the projects we did were, let's do payments for this community or a loan for this community. When we're talking about creating an ecosystem at scale, we have to think a little broader. So with insurance comes a loan, comes digital extension, comes an agreement with an off-taker. So we try to close the loop. So AI has such powerful potential, but our biggest challenge beyond technical integration is really building the business value for each partner, and then co-creating the value proposition for everybody in a way that meets the nonprofit's goals. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate it. I'm actually going to stay on you for two questions. One, we have a question in the chat from Michael Nolan. He says, when you say reduces bank lending risk by up to 70%, do you mean that farmers who happen to own/work land labeled as high risk are less likely to be able to access financing? And then I'm going to
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Following, if you can answer that question, and then following that question, if you could also talk about some lessons learned from using this partnership model and perhaps some challenges that you face, that would be great.
Yeah, so the first one on the 70%, and this is fascinating. When I first started on this project, we were working with a bank and we said, well, because this insurance is really around climate insurance, right? So protecting a farmer if they grow a crop and it gets destroyed by drought and they can't pay their loan back. So the 70% model came from, we worked with a bank in Tanzania and said, well, what is your risk of crop failure due to drought? They came up with 50%. I met with Bank of Kigali a few weeks ago. They said theirs is 70%. So the actual risk of lending to a farmer, 50 to 70% of their loan risk is on climate. And the other risk are the individual farmer risk and the market risk, right? The second question is, well, I think there's a question about whether the farmer had to own the land. This is really about, you incent the lenders by reducing their lending risk.
You incent the farmers, because if the farmers would love to get better seeds, they'd love to get better crops, they'd love to buy insurance, but they do not want to take the risk of putting all this extra time and money into it if they can't sell it. So as long as we have an off-taker, a market off-taker as part of this partnership model, we solve for the farmers' risks. Some of the lessons learned, and we've done this across a few finance models, some of the lessons learned are the NGOs and nonprofits generally are hesitant to engage the market side, the off-takers, because NGOs really want to be down at the field level with the farmers. But really solving for the commercial need for the farmer is really important, and engaging those big commercial partners is important. When you engage the big commercial partners, NGOs and them often speak different languages. So having that interaction where we can talk to the big commercial partner and say, okay, how much money do you need to make? What's your cost of entry? What risk are we solving for you? At the end, we want to solve for the NGO, but solving for the market players first is critically important. Other lessons learned is that it's hard. It takes a long time, and if you have a big bank involved because their money is cheaper, it takes longer, right? So we think big. We start with fairly small, quick wins, but we always keep massive scale at the center of our business plan, because if it doesn't scale, then it's just a pilot, and anybody can do a pilot. But I don't want to discourage pilots. They're great. We learn a lot, but to do scale, you really have to keep scale at the center of your model from the beginning to the end.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. I'm gonna turn it over now to Lucie for the same question. What are some of the key lessons learned from the partnership model that you went over, and some of the challenges as well?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for asking that question. So I would say, I would want to draw into one of our partnerships to answer that question. So, the main lesson learned is that it's really important to get people who are feeling a problem to solve the problem, who are truly affected by the problem to solve the problem. And an example that I'd want to bring up is our partnership with World Resources Institute. So like I said, we've done now 5 projects with them, and they're an NGO and they're operating in different geographical regions. And we've done projects mainly around improving policymaking inefficiencies for them, so building solutions around decreasing the inefficiencies in their policy makings. And we've done projects with them in Latin America, India, and Africa, for example. And just to give you context around that, so for example, the project we did with them in India is around modeling, figuring out how we can model economic well-being in different regions in India by using AI and satellite imagery. Because right now what they're doing is they're using census data, which is collected every 10 years. So policymakers are making decisions and policies around census data that they're looking at that might be 8 to 10 years old. So they came to us to identify if we can use satellite imagery to come up with a development index for different regions, or a model that would be able to look at different regions through satellite imagery in India and come up with development indexes, so that the policymakers then at a touch of a button can see what's going on and not rely on old data. And the reason why, and one of the important factors, and the reason why I'm bringing that up, is that 40 to 50% of that team that we got together to work on that problem is actually from India. And the important thing is that the people from India in those different regions, they understand the problem at hand, and they understand why it needs to be solved, and therefore the solution is better. And we received a 70% accuracy in our model, and we're now scaling that out with World Resources Institute. And the same thing can be applied to the project we're doing with them in Africa and the one that we did with them in Latin America. Over 40 to 50% of the team was from the local areas, and that is really the difference, because as I said, that will make, as Paul also said, you have to think about scalability from the start, and that's what that's what will make the solution scalable. So that's a key learning, and that's what we see across all of our projects. Now, the difficulty in convincing, especially NGOs, or not convincing, but demonstrating to them that this model is something that's necessary, is how do you convince big NGOs that 40 to 60 people can come together and work on a problem they've never met before, and they can actually deliver a solution that's something that the NGO or the company can get funding for, or scale out, or leverage in some way. So that's the challenge that I think we're overcoming, just based on all of the past successes that we've had with our partnerships. But it's obviously going to, especially in the NGO space, that challenge is going to stay. And I think only through, educating, also as Leila mentioning, from the beginning of the life cycle to the end, educating people, and also going through that whole life cycle of showing how it will work, and then actually putting a plan together to capacity build, for example, or identify that this model can be implemented at scale.
Great, thank you, Lucie. Leila, over to you with the same questions about lessons learned and some challenges you faced.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'll just echo a couple of things and then build on that. So maybe just to summarize a couple of things that Paul and Lucie mentioned, and something that we focus on, which is to be intentional about every aspect of the project. That means what team, who's part of the team that's building the specific solution, what data you're using, and how are you managing that? How are you implementing this? Who has access to the solution? So really intentionality is key to creating something that is truly relevant, sustainable, and also responsible. Second, and again, that's another kind of meta trend that has actually driven the creation of the toolkits that I shared earlier, is knowing what questions to ask. Not everybody needs to be a data scientist and an expert, but at least knowing what questions to ask and how to evaluate whether certain technologies are a good fit for a specific problem in the context in which the problem exists. Just because we can do it doesn't mean that we should, given many of the risks. How might being able to ask around some of the questions related to ethical considerations, like how might data or machine learning models implement and the implementations cause disproportionate harm to certain populations? What happens when things go wrong? Who's actually accountable once you begin implementing, even in the pilot stage, and especially as you're scaling and sustaining? And then I would say that kind of one of the other aspects, and just to echo what Paul was talking about earlier, which is a challenge sometimes in the nonprofit sector, is to plan for sustainability. And a couple of things to think about from the beginning. One is the ownership. So I talked about local ownership and capacity building, so that NGOs could actually own from the initial MVP and pilot all the way through to scale and sustainability, and know how to refresh the models, update them, and gather and refresh the data. So that's kind of another aspect. And part of that is also thinking through, who do you need to partner? Because here we're talking about partnership models, and your partners might change over time. The partner that helped you build the MVP and the pilot might be different from the partner that helps you scale and actually reach all the people in need who could benefit from that solution. And then I guess the last point I will add, which is why local ownership and some of the how fast we've been able to actually develop MVP has been possible, is that the pace of change and the technological advancement is getting us to a point where we now have no code or low code solutions that don't require specialized technical expertise. So we always talk to our technology partners and encourage them to really consider developing more of these solutions that will enable a lot more people who know what the problems are that need to be solved to actually use those tools to solve the problems, rather than rely on experts in some of these centers like Silicon Valley and or Seattle or somewhere else.
Thank you, Leila. I invite people to put their questions and comments in the chat. We also invite people who are interested in sharing their unique partnership models that they've used in the past in the chat, and then we can have you come off mute and contribute to the conversation as well. So please use the chat. I'm going to actually, Leila, go back to you because I think you were getting at a lot of the answer to the next question. And so I want to build on that. How do you create the conditions for responsible innovation in cross-sectoral partnerships? So what are those underlying conditions that are really useful or necessary in those partnerships?
Sure, I'll just add a couple of points in addition to what I shared earlier. One is really starting with a problem we're trying to solve, because oftentimes as a technology consortium, as technologists, we might see so many technologies that are actually that we could be using to solve our problems. But if we don't understand the problem and the context, oftentimes we'll create solutions that are actually not meaningful, not useful, and it could potentially create larger risks and harms to the populations we're trying to help. So getting, especially with your partners that might not be within the sector and familiar with a problem, it's important to align on what problem are you solving, and then think about solutions holistically that might include not just the technology, but also change management process within an organization in order to, and additional programming in order to implement that solution effectively. The other one, especially when working with different partners, let's say with tech companies or academic institutions, is to clearly, again, articulate roles and responsibilities. Who owns what? And get very granular from the beginning. And then also to create a timeline that gets you to an MVP, minimum viable product, that you can test with your target audience relatively quickly. And then lastly, when getting started with some of these emerging technologies, one of the challenges that nonprofits have is finding donors that want to invest in something that is new and potentially risky and unproven. So it is important to take time to secure the seed funding and resources, which might be technical expertise, let's say from Omdena, in order to develop your solution.
Great, thanks so much, Leila. I'm going to throw it over to Lucie for the same question on the how you create the conditions for responsible innovation in these partnerships.
Yeah, thanks. I was hoping we'd go to me next, because I actually wanted to kind of tie back to what Leila was saying in the context of defining your problem first, right? So many in the context of tech, right? So many people think, how am I going to implement AI or data science or machine learning, or how am I going to become technologically enabled without data? And that's the wrong way to approach it, because we've done multiple projects with multiple partners who didn't even have data and didn't even have an idea of how they were going to use technology or anything to improve their inefficiencies in order to do their jobs better and focus what they're there for. So a good example of that is, one, just echoing exactly what Leila said, is formulating your problem. And I can draw on a practical example. One of our partners, International Social Services, a 96-year-old NGO who is focused on connecting immigrant families who get disconnected when they join or when they enter a country. And their problem was that they have so many case studies to go through, and so many case workers are going through them, that it leads to a lot of inefficiencies in connecting actually the families, so doing their jobs. And the CEO of ISS, his motivation to coming to us to identifying or providing a roadmap for their organization was that they have a case, and it's the longest case that had been open and hadn't been closed in their organization. It had been open for 19 years, where a mother in Indonesia hadn't been connected to her son in Australia, and they'd been looking for each other. And one piece of technology, a computer vision software, an application, actually identified teddy bears in two pictures of the child and the mother, and connected them, right? So all of the work, the cases that the caseworkers had been doing and that ISIS is there for, that didn't solve the problem. The problem was in an application. And that's where he realized, okay, we don't have data because the data is regulated, and we don't have, readily available access to it. So we can't do anything with it, but we need a roadmap. and we need a roadmap because we have a problem that we're addressing. So the going back to your question, you know, it starts with the problem, formulating the problem. You don't need that expertise to begin with, because data without data is irrelevant if you don't have a problem to solve, and then you can go back from there. So I hope that answers the question, but I really wanted to add that on to what Leila was saying.
Absolutely, thank you. And we have a few comments in the chat that I'm gonna read out before we go over to you, Paul. So Justin Bars mentioned that he's interested on the comment on cross-sector partnerships, and asked, is there attention on data frameworks and data models to draw NGOs together to standardize solutions? So I'm not sure if someone wants to address that question, if you want me to call on one of you.
I can give it a shot.
Great.
You know, so there are data lakes out there of all kind of information, whether it's you know, satellite imagery or huge data sets. And the challenge that we see country to country is that the same thing is being done with different models, right, and different standards. So there's two things that are happening right now. One is a drive for standardization for common content. So we see drives around, you know, extension content or payment content, and these kind of burgeoning standards initiatives to create some common frameworks around standard use cases. And the second one is rather than frameworks, sometimes just a lot of reusability in the models. API models and API business models, the ability of data to be accessed across multiple sectors, so finance, ag, healthcare, as long as those models are published and they're well managed, they can become accessible to a lot of folks. But back to Leila's comment about capacity building, just building the capacity to make the data available, and then the capacity on the receiving end to be able to get to it is a huge issue, and something that the community, the donor community, you know, is really working on supporting at scale. So that's my pitch.
Great. Thank you, Paul.
I can add something from the specific. Obviously, when we talk about data, we can spend another session just talking about all the challenges related to data, and also there are different types of data. So in the context of the example that I shared earlier, which is more of the kind of simple AI solution, actually using a no-code tool, the data that we're talking about, we're actually talking about data in two different ways. One is the curated library of content that is available to the end user. And in that context, yes, we have actually a number of NGOs working together to curate, to source and curate and manage that library. And we're looking at also a crowdsourcing model to actually continue to refresh that. So that's one. So that's just the knowledge base that actually we need to have a lot, more examples of organizations collaborating on that, because there's a lot of fragmentation and silos with kind of the knowledge bases. And then the second is around data about a person, let's say a profile, information that you might need in order to serve up the right information to them. And this is also where we're being very careful about what information do you actually need from the end user in order to meet their needs, and in what context, who's managing that, how's that data being gathered, who has access to it. So there's also the kind of ethical considerations related to the data you might need and how you're managing that data. So again, this could be a much longer conversation. I know we have a number of questions coming through the chat window from what I'm seeing.
Yeah, Leila, I'm actually going to stay with you because we have a question for you that says, do you think donors need to be in the ecosystem for a long period of time, not just for 3 to 5 years? Because so many pilots and innovations were made by donor funding, and we get stuck in the question of sustainability. If we can ensure funding for a long period of time, do you think people, users, and other stakeholders will trust and will be habituated with a great solution to their problem?
Yeah, such an important question. And thank you for asking the question about how donors can support some of this work. In one of the links that I shared, I think it's the first link, it's actually based on a recent round of consultations that I did with a number of our NGO members. And one of the areas of focus is really around what kind of seed investment or investment is needed in order for the NGOs to get started. And also to create solutions that are truly sustainable. So this is what I want to just quickly focus on. The question that we need to ask is less about the time, it's more around what is actually funding needed for. So I'll just mention a couple of things and why we're able to actually, we're able to implement the project that I talked about earlier. One is cash for staff time in order to really allocate enough resources for that local ownership from the beginning to end to be possible. Sometimes acquisition of data or maybe content, acquisition of additional infrastructure, capacity building. So it's really looking at across the whole life cycle from how do you get started and build the MVP to testing and iterating to maintaining what donor support is needed. Some of that could be cash, other could be actually in-kind donations, whether it's product or expertise. So I'm happy to talk more about this, but it really kind of goes back to what problem are you trying to solve, and then what does that project look like to reach the scale and sustainability. The last point that I'll add on this, which is something that NetHope focuses on, is how do we actually avoid duplication and waste in a system? So with these specific projects that I talked about, we're looking at templatizing. So create templates of these specific chatbots and make them available to more organizations so they can actually go solve some of those same problems using obviously their own information and with much less cost, because the initial cost was already covered by the first set of partners.
Thanks so much, Leila. Paul, I'm gonna pivot over to you. You're welcome to share if you have anything to add on the conditions for responsible innovation, but in the interest of time, I also want to ask the next question about how COVID-19 has affected your partnerships and collaborations, how you're able to manage local and global partners given the pandemic.
Yeah, everything kind of went to hell last year. I mean, you know, we do stuff in the field, and when you're doing last mile delivery, being in the field is critically important. But everybody saw that. I would say the biggest challenge that happened, that we see happening at scale, is that there's probably more money that's coming in, but less people, right? So the donors and the big money folks who come on the ground and have all these conversations and get to know the market are not coming now. And we've been a year out. So how stale is their information? So just staying in touch with them, hearing about what they're thinking about, making sure we're giving them feedback on what we're seeing. I think that's part of the community that we have to keep the cycle going. And that's just been the biggest challenge. Being in East Africa for the last year, it's been exciting. You know, locked down in one country for a few months and then go to another one, but it's possible. But I don't think we're not going to see a lot of imports coming in. A lot of, you know, if you think about emergency food relief, there's a huge famine coming up in East Africa. That's just not going to happen because of COVID. So, but the money is coming. So it's up to the people on the ground really to be creative and more assertive and think bigger about solving the problems where we can only just count on money coming in. And it sounds great, right? But it's kind of scary because it puts a lot more responsibility on us to get some big things done without having the traditional support network that would commonly come in.
Great, thanks. Lucie, I'm going to ask you the same question, and then also, if possible, for you to address the question that just in the chat. I'll go ahead and read it out loud. I'm concerned about the possible impact of AI-supported decision-making. It is related to the black box dilemma, i.e. it takes significant effort to analyze and understand the analysis correlations made by the algorithm. Unless we know enough about the technology to be able to ensure that it works correctly, we run the risk of causing harm to large groups of people. Beneficiaries in development countries are even less able to claim their rights when this happens. So despite the potential, are we really ready to apply AI to provide solutions for very vulnerable populations? So two quite big questions that I'm throwing your way, Lucie.
Yes. So thanks for actually asking that question. That's actually a really important question in the space as well. And I think that goes back to the really important point of who is building the AI, right? So if we go back to the research in the field, for example, Timnit Gebru, a very prominent AI researcher in ethics, right? So she particularly bases her research on identifying unethical AI solutions in the space, right? And like 2 years ago, she actually got a lot of recognition for identifying the bias and the harm in Amazon's facial recognition technology, which is actually now taken off of the market. And what I have to say about that is that the problem with that solution was, again, going back to what data was used and who was building that AI solution. So that solution, it was built based on data that was biased towards people of ethnically not dark colored people, basically, So that's the reason why that product was taken off the market and why that caused harm to a large amount of people. So now going back to your question of, when do we know when we're ready to apply this technology to more vulnerable populations, is when we can start involving the people who are being affected by the technology and by the problem at hand. If we involve them in building the solution, we can ensure that the solution itself will not be racially biased or will not be unethical, because let's say in that facial recognition software, right, if there was somebody on the team who couldn't be recognized by the software because of the color of their skin, then they would have been able to contribute to making the technology different. And that's how, through our platform, that's why we stress with the very specific regional problems that we're solving for our partners, that we get a team together that are facing that same problem, so that we can actually use that solution to scale out and not harm the vulnerable populations that they're meant to help.
Thank you so much, Lucie. And do you want to comment on how COVID-19 has affected your partnerships and collaborations?
I think that's a less relevant question to our organization, to be honest, just because of the way that we operate. So we, I wouldn't say that the COVID has obviously affected our partners a lot, which in turn have made them actually come to us to help them, right? In fact, we actually did a project about COVID-19. So how can we assess how governments are reacting to COVID-19 and how that's impacting the populations themselves, high increased rate of sexual abuse happening, or abuse in general happening internally because of government lockdowns. So we've actually had it hasn't directly affected us because of the kind of global nature of our work, but we have worked with certain partners and government bodies to identify COVID and its effects on the world, which is more applicable to us.
Great, thank you so much, Lucie. We definitely want to leave time for people to comment and put questions in the chat, so please continue to do so. I'm going to actually read this one out loud now. Thanks. I think besides the beneficiaries, we need to involve a triangle of people that typically do not understand enough of each other's work: legal specialists for the rights and privacy, IT experts, and program managers who need to make it work in the field. Leila, do you want to speak to that and also address your organization's, the impact of COVID-19 on your organization as well?
No, I absolutely agree, and I think we talked about this in the session. It's that intentionality around who needs to be part of that building a solution, and part of that is, everything, everybody from people who actually know the problem really well and who are experiencing this specific problem, as Lucie shared earlier, technologists, human rights specialists. It really depends on what problem is being solved, but it needs to be a really diverse and inclusive and transparent process. So that's kind of one thing. And the second thing that I added in the chat window is really just to echo the importance of the nonprofit sector to really understanding what are some of the risks of using some of these powerful technologies that can quickly scale and amplify bias and many of the other harmful risks to the populations that we serve, and knowing how to, knowing what those risks are and how to build solutions and when to build certain solutions, when to use certain technologies. This is why we've created this toolkit that actually the first installment focuses on the optimizing for fairness and mitigating the risks of bias. So that's just to close on that question. In terms of the impact of COVID, I noted that actually these projects emerged from some of the impact that COVID has had on the nonprofit sector, specifically humanitarian staff having to work remotely and socially distance, so accessing information, accessing services and support. The other one that I think is important that we're spending a lot of time on in the nonprofit sector is also upgrading our skills in terms of virtual collaboration. This project that we're doing is fully being done in a virtual setting. So how do you actually develop something that is, again, inclusive and can be it can involve the different experts from all around the world. So we're leveraging a combination of Zoom, Teams, Miro, Power Virtual Agents in order to actually develop this solution. So I'll share in the chat window actually some of the tips that we put together.
Great, thank you. Paul, over to you for your comment on that. And then I also want you to address our last question, which is, what does the future hold for partnerships and how do we see these models changing?
Thanks. So yeah, I just wanted to go back to Leila, to the question to you around legal. And typically, you know, what I see or what we see in large NGOs and support organizations are, you know, there are technology programs, there are policy programs, and there are kind of business programs that are funded. And the policy experts, it's a really remarkable kind of world they live in, where they're working with all these different governments. What we don't have right now, what I don't see, is some really good frameworks and applicable standards around data and ICT policy, right? We see, oh, there's a privacy policy, and there's some, and ministries of ICT are popping up around African countries. And so there's this groundswell of interest in understanding what these policies should be, but not the maturity that we see in other policies around, you know, seeds or healthcare or you know, standard policy areas. So it'd be great to see some of the funders, as they're funding ICT programs, to also put significant you know, effort into driving this policy standardization around data and ICT. And the future, yeah, the future is market making, right? The future is ecosystem, it's integration, innovation in the next 5 years will really be around ecosystem integration. It pushes us all out of our comfort zones into really working with the full commercial models. It's much bigger, right? Especially in ICT, there's been, you know, several years of small pilot work, learning, and now it's time to put it all together. So it's really about becoming business and market advocates at the same time of being advocates for, you know, the least fortunate, the people who need the most. So I think it's exciting. It's a pivot, and you know, there's going to be new themes and new buzzwords and new characters that pop up. It's going to be an exciting time, and things are going to be impacting you know, millions of people instead of tens of thousands. So it's going to be very exciting.
Thanks, Paul. We have about 1 minute left. So Lucie and Leila, I'm going to give you a minute, 30 seconds each to give me a few sentences about the future of partnerships as well. So Lucie, can we start with you? Ooh, looks like you're on mute. Lucie, it looks like you're on mute. Looks like you're having trouble unmuting. So Leila, I'm going to jump to you. If you can unmute yourself.
I think one of the things that we didn't mention in this discussion or as much, and that's something that we did, really ask our partners and members to think about, is really starting small. Starting small, improving the value, and also building a sustainable partnership. So instead of tackling a massive problem, a multi-year problem, maybe it is starting on something that you can get done in 2 months or 6 months, and also iterate on the partnership and then think about the evolution that you need to make in order to scale it and sustain it.
Thanks, Leila. And Lucie, are you able to come off mute? No, we can't hear you. That's all right. So maybe Lucie can follow up with the group later on. I will also, Lucie, address your attention to the comment in the chat from Richard Martin, and maybe you can get his contact information and email him after this session is over. So that's it for today. I want to thank you all for joining. This was a really helpful and great session. And so if you have follow-up questions, I'm sure all the panelists would love to hear from you all. And please enjoy the rest of the conference.